My name is Stella Frost. I'm 32, and I learned what it feels like to be erased while sitting at a Thanksgiving table with 31 other people watching it happen in real time, not in some quiet argument behind closed doors, not in a moment you could pretend didn't happen later, but right there, between the turkey and the cranberry sauce, under warm lighting and polite conversation like it was just another item on the evening schedule. And the thing about moments like that is they don't start loud. They start small, almost forgettable, like my father swirling whiskey in his glass and staring at it like it owed him answers. And if you didn't know him, you'd think he was just tired, maybe a long week at work, maybe a couple drinks, too many before dinner, nothing worth paying attention to, except I had seen that look before, that distant, checked-out version of him that showed up whenever I walked into a room. Like my presence required some kind of emotional adjustment he didn't feel like making, and I should have known something was coming. But you don't sit down at Thanksgiving expecting your life to split in half. You sit down, expecting awkward small talk, and maybe someone arguing about politics, not your own father deciding to publicly disown you between the stuffing and dessert. So I sat there smiling when expected, answering questions about my job at the hospital in short, polite sentences, keeping things surface level the way you do when you've spent years learning that the less you say, the safer you are. And across from me, my stepmother was already holding a tissue before anything had even happened, which I didn't register at the time, but later realized was the kind of detail that tells you everything. If you're willing to see it, like someone bringing an umbrella on a day that hasn't started raining yet, and then my uncle asked my father a simple question, something harmless about work or golf or whatever men his age talk about when they want to avoid anything real, and instead of answering, my father let out this quiet, almost annoyed laugh and said, "She's independent because she's not really part of this family." And for a second, nobody reacted because it didn't land right away. It just hung there unclear, like maybe he misspoke or maybe it was some kind of joke that didn't quite connect. But then my uncle, trying to smooth it over, asked what he meant. And that's when my father lifted his head, looked straight at me and said it louder, clearer, like he wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding. "I'm done pretending she's not my daughter, and I swear." You could feel the room physically shift, like the air got heavier all at once. Forks paused midair. Someone dropped a glass and didn't even pick it up right away. A kid at the end of the table asked why Uncle Richard was yelling. And two of my aunts stood up at the same time and started clearing plates that weren't even empty yet, because people don't know what to do with their hands. When something like that happens, they just need to move to look busy, to pretend this is still a normal dinner and not a public execution of someone's identity. And I sat there completely still, because when something that big hits you, your body doesn't react the way you think it will. There's no dramatic outburst, no immediate tears, just this quiet, almost clinical realization that everything you thought was stable has just been pulled out from under you. And the worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was the way people looked at me after, not with anger or even judgment, but with that uncomfortable curiosity, like I had just become a problem they didn't know how to categorize, like they were mentally rearranging years of memories to fit this new version of me. My father had just introduced, and across the table my stepmother pressed that tissue to her eye in this slow, practiced motion, not shocked, not confused, just ready, like she had been waiting for this exact moment, and all she had to do now was play her part. And I remember thinking how strange it was that she wasn't asking him to stop, wasn't correcting him, wasn't even pretending this was out of line. She just let it happen, which told me everything I needed to know without her saying a single word. And then there was my father, still standing, both hands flat on the table, like he needed the support, staring at me like I was a stranger he had just decided he didn't want to be associated with anymore. And I searched his face for something, anything familiar, some sign that this was temporary, that he would sit back down and say he didn't mean it, that he was drunk or angry or just having a moment. But there was nothing there, just this cold certainty, like he had rehearsed this in his head enough times that saying it out loud felt like relief. And in that moment I understood something I wish I had figured out years earlier, that this wasn't about one sentence or one night. This was the result of something that had been building quietly for a long time. something I had felt but never fully named, like being slowly edged out of your own life while still technically being present in it, and now it was finally out in the open. Clean and undeniable, and the room didn't know what to do with that, so people started looking away, focusing on their plates, their drinks, anything but me, because acknowledging it would mean taking a side, and nobody wants to take a side at Thanksgiving, not when it might cost them their comfort. And I realized, sitting there, that I had just lost something that wasn't coming back. Not just my father's approval or whatever version of family I had been trying to hold on to, but the illusion that if I just tried hard enough, stayed quiet enough, made myself small enough, I could still belong there, because in one sentence, he made it clear that I never did, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of everything that had been left unsaid for years. Every look, every dismissal, every moment I had explained away to myself, because it was easier than facing the truth, and now the truth was sitting right there at the table with us. And nobody could pretend not to see it anymore. I kept my hands in my lap because if I moved too fast, I thought I might break something, and the first place my mind went wasn't forward. It went back to the week we buried my mother, because that was the last time anything in my life I felt honest. I was 13, standing in a dress that didn't fit the cream moment, because it was the only black thing I owned, something my mom had picked out months earlier for a school dance that suddenly became funeral clothes. And I remember looking at the casket and waiting for my dad to reach for me, just a hand on my shoulder, something small that said we were still a unit, still a team, but he stood a few feet away like I was part of the background, staring at the coffin like it had personally offended him. And the only person who touched me that day was my grandmother, who pulled me in close and told me to breathe, like she was trying to keep me from disappearing right there in the cemetery. And for a while I thought maybe my dad was just grieving in his own way. People say that all the time, everyone handles loss differently, so I gave him space. I stayed quiet. I tried not to need anything, because needing something from someone who can't give it feels like asking a locked door to open just because you knocked politely. And then 4 months later, he brought a woman home like we were starting a new chapter nobody had agreed to. He said her name was Diane. Said it casually, like I was supposed to recognize her, like she had always been there and I just hadn't noticed. And she had a daughter, Lauren, who was younger than me, and smiled in that way kids do when they're trying to be liked. And I didn't hate her, not then, because none of this was her fault, but I noticed right away how my dad picked her up, how he carried her like she weighed nothing, and it hit me in this quiet, uncomfortable way that I couldn't remember the last time he had done that with me. Not since I was little, not since before my mom got sick, and within weeks, Diane wasn't a visitor anymore. She was living in the house, moving things around like she had the right, changing the way everything looked and felt without ever asking me what I thought. And then one day she told me I needed to switch rooms. Not suggested, not discussed, just decided, because Lauren needed the bigger bedroom, the one with the sunlight and the window facing the tree my mom planted. And she said it like it was obvious, like it made perfect sense, like fairness had nothing to do with it. And my dad didn't argue, didn't even hesitate, just stood there and let it happen. And that was the moment something shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Because it wasn't just about the room, it was about realizing I didn't have a place in decisions about my own life anymore. I was being rearranged, moved to wherever I caused the least inconvenience. And the basement became my new space, if you could call it that. Concrete walls, one small window near the ceiling that let in just enough light to remind you what you were missing cold in. The winter damp in the summer, and I remember taping my school certificates next to the light switch, because there wasn't anywhere else to put them, like I was trying to prove something to a room that didn't care, and I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle, that once everyone adjusted I would find my way back into the center of things. But that center kept moving further away, and upstairs became a different world, one where Diane set the tone, where Lauren had everything she needed before she even asked, where my dad laughed again. But never when I was around, and I learned quickly how to navigate it, how to stay out of the way, how to anticipate what was expected of me, so I wouldn't give anyone a reason to be annoyed. Because annoyance was the one thing that seemed to turn into something bigger every time. And the hardest part wasn't anything loud or obvious. It was the quiet pattern of being overlooked, the way conversations stopped, including me, the way decisions were made without me, the way my presence felt. Optional at best and inconvenient at worst. And I kept trying to earn my place back without realizing that you can't earn something that someone has already decided not to give you. And every now and then my grandmother would come by and walk through the house, slowly noticing things no one else acknowledged, like the fact that I was living in the basement while a newer, brighter room sat upstairs, and she never made a scene about it, never confronted anyone in that loud, dramatic way people expect, but she would look at me in this steady, knowing way and say things that didn't fully make sense at the time, like reminding me that the house wasn't theirs to give away, that I wasn't as replaceable as they were acting like I was, and I held on to those words even when I didn't fully understand them, because they were the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't imagining what was happening. And as the months turned into years, my dad didn't come back to me the way I kept expecting him to. He just got more distant, more comfortable in this new version of his life where I existed on the edges. And Diane didn't need to push me out directly, because the environment she created did that for her. It made it easier for everyone to accept the new arrangement without questioning it, and I adapted the way kids do when they don't, to have a choice. I became low maintenance, independent, easy to ignore, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it's just another way of saying you learned how to survive without being seen and sitting at that Thanksgiving table years later. Listening to my father say I wasn't really part of the family, I understood that it hadn't started that night. It started back then in small decisions that seemed harmless on their own but added up to something permanent, something that slowly rewrote my place in that house, until one day there was nothing left to rewrite, just the final version spoken out loud for everyone to hear. I learned pretty quickly that Diane didn't fight battles out loud. She didn't raise her voice or make dramatic accusations where people could push back. She worked in quiet, careful sentences that sounded harmless if you heard them once, but started to stick if you heard them often enough. And the first time I caught it clearly, I wasn't even supposed to be part of the conversation. It was late. I had gone upstairs for a glass of water, and I stopped when I heard her voice from the kitchen, low, controlled, the kind of tone people use when they want to sound concerned instead of strategic, and she said something like, "Have you ever really looked at her?" And there was this pause that stretched just long enough to make the question feel heavier than it should have been, and my dad didn't answer right away, which told me more than if he had. And then she added, still calm, still reasonable, "She doesn't have your eyes, Richard. She doesn't have your jaw." And if you heard that as an outsider, you might think it was just observation, just someone noticing differences. But I could feel what she was doing even then. She wasn't trying to prove anything in that moment. She was planting something that didn't need to grow fast as long as it kept growing. And my dad just sat there peeling the label off his beer bottle, like that was more important than responding. And that silence became her permission, because she didn't need him to agree. She just needed him not to disagree. And from that night on, it didn't stop. It just spread into different rooms, different conversations, different people, always slightly adjusted depending on the audience, like she understood exactly how much to say and how much to leave unsaid, so other people would fill in the blanks themselves. And at family gatherings, she never accused my mom directly. She would sigh at the right moment, shake her head like she didn't want to say too much, and then drop something just vague enough to sound like concern instead of gossip. "Richard's been under a lot of stress," or "It's hard when you start seeing things that don't add up," and people would lean in, ask what she meant. And she would pull back just enough to look like the reasonable one, like she was protecting everyone from something unpleasant. And the truth is, people don't question that kind of delivery. They trust it because it doesn't feel aggressive. It feels like someone reluctantly sharing something difficult. And that's how she built credibility without ever having to prove anything. And over time, I could see the shift not just in my dad, but in everyone around us, the way conversations changed when I walked into a room, the way certain questions stopped being asked, the way I started getting those looks that weren't openly hostile but weren't warm either. Like people were trying to reconcile two versions of reality and didn't know which one to commit to. And my dad, he didn't transform overnight. It was slower than that, more unsettling because of how gradual it was. He just stopped defending things he used to stand firm on, stopped correcting people, stopped engaging with me the way he used to. And at first I told myself it was grief that losing my mom had changed him, that maybe I reminded him of something painful. And I adjusted my behavior to make it easier on him. I stayed out of his way. I made sure there was nothing about me. He could complain about good grades, no trouble helpful around the house, the kind of kid people point to and say, "See, she's doing everything right." But that didn't matter because Diane wasn't attacking my behavior. She was reshaping how he saw me at a fundamental level, and once that perception started to shift, no amount of effort on my part could compete with it. Because I was reacting in real time, and she was building a narrative over years, and the more he absorbed it, the less he questioned it, until it stopped feeling like something he had been told and started feeling like something he had always known. And that's the part people don't talk about. How easy it is to rewrite someone's memory. If you're patient enough, if you repeat something just often enough, and in just the right tone, it stops sounding like an opinion and starts sounding like a fact. And I watched that happen in small, almost invisible ways, like the way he would hesitate before answering simple questions about me, or how he started introducing me with this subtle distance in his voice, like he was already separating himself without fully committing to it yet. And Diane kept reinforcing it socially, not just at home, because she understood that if she could get other people to see me a certain way, it would come back around and validate what she was telling him. So she controlled the narrative at church, at neighborhood events, with relatives always presenting herself as the supportive wife dealing with a complicated situation she didn't want to make worse, and people rewarded that performance by trusting her version of events because it was easier than questioning it, easier than considering that something unfair was happening right in front of them, and I could feel the room shifting over the years. Like I was slowly being edited out of a story I was still physically present in, and the worst part was how normal it started to feel, how I adapted to it without even realizing it, how I lowered my expectations piece by piece until I wasn't expecting anything from him anymore. Not attention, not support, not even basic acknowledgement. And when you reach that point, when you stop expecting something, you also stop being surprised when it's taken away completely. So when he stood up at that table and said I wasn't his daughter, it sounded shocking to everyone else, but to me it felt like the final version of something I had been watching develop for years, like a conclusion that had already been written long before it was spoken out loud. I kept thinking if I just did everything right, it would eventually even out, like there was some invisible scoreboard I couldn't see yet, and one day someone would finally add it up and say, okay, she's done enough, let's treat her like she belongs here again. So I made myself easy, not loud, not demanding. The kind of kid adults don't have to worry about. I kept my grades high because that was one thing I could control: straight A's honor roll. The kind of report cards teachers used as examples, and I made sure they saw them not in a bragging way, just leaving them where they'd notice on the kitchen counter by the mail, hoping my dad might pick one up, say something simple like, "Good job," but most of the time, he didn't even look, and when he did, it was quick like checking a receipt. No real reaction, just a nod if I was lucky. And I started helping around the house without being asked, cooking dinner a few nights a week. Cleaning up after everyone else, running errands Diane didn't feel like doing, because I thought if I made myself useful enough, if I removed every possible inconvenience, there'd be no reason to keep pushing me to the edges. But usefulness isn't the same as belonging. It just makes you easier to take for granted, and I didn't understand that yet, so I kept going, kept adjusting, kept trying to meet expectations nobody had clearly defined, and then came college, which felt like the first real test of whether any of it mattered. I got into a solid nursing program, not easy to get into something I had worked toward for years, and I remember standing on the porch with my acceptance letter rehearsing what I was going to say to my dad, keeping it simple, respectful, not asking for everything, just some help, some sign that he was still invested in my future. And when I finally said it, when I told him I got in and asked if he could help with tuition, he didn't say no. He didn't say yes either. He just said he'd think about it, didn't even look up from his paper, and I waited. Gave him time, didn't push, because pushing had never worked in that house. And a week later, at dinner, Diane casually announced that Lauren would be going to a private prep school. Full tuition, covered new laptop uniforms, everything lined up like it had been planned for months. And my dad smiled, proud, supportive, the way I had been hoping he'd look at me. And that was my answer. Not spoken directly, but clear enough that I didn't need to ask again, so I figured it out myself. Loans, part-time jobs, early shifts, late shifts, stacking hours, wherever I could, balancing classes with work. Eating quick meals between shifts, studying in quiet corners, because going home wasn't exactly a place you could focus, and I didn't complain not to them because I already knew how that would go. It would either be dismissed or turned into something about how I was choosing to be independent. Like that was always the narrative, that anything I did on my own was proof I didn't need them, not evidence that they had left me to figure it out alone. And through all of it, my dad called me 3 times. In 4 years, and every call was the same. Not how are you holding up, not do you need anything, just when are you graduating, like he was tracking an end date. A point where I would officially be out of his responsibility, and when graduation finally came, I walked across that stage knowing exactly who had been part of that journey and who hadn't, and I looked out into the crowd scanning for him, even though I already knew the answer and he wasn't there. Because he and Diane had flown out for Lauren's graduation the same week, same weekend, and they chose hers, and I stood there in my white coat holding my degree, smiling for photos, shaking hands, while in the back of my mind there was this quiet, steady realization that I had done everything I was supposed to do, and it still didn't change how I was treated. And that's when the comparisons really stopped being subtle, because it wasn't just different paths, it was different levels of support, different expectations, different standards entirely. Lauren got investment attention, encouragement, the assumption that her success mattered to the whole family, and I got distance. Minimal acknowledgement, and this unspoken understanding that whatever I achieved was something I handled on my own, which somehow made it less important. And the more I noticed it, the harder it became to ignore, like once you see the pattern. You can't unsee it. You start connecting things that didn't seem related before, the way decisions were made, the way conversations were framed, the way I was introduced compared to her. And I realized it wasn't just about individual moments. It was about how I was positioned in that family overall, always slightly outside, always just enough distance to make it clear I wasn't on the same level, and I tried for a long time to keep proving that I deserved to be there anyway, that I could close that gap if I just kept showing up, kept doing the right things. But eventually, you run into a point where effort doesn't change the outcome, where the system you're trying to succeed in isn't designed for you to win. And sitting at that Thanksgiving table hearing my dad say I wasn't really part of the family, I understood that none of those years had been neutral. They had been building toward that moment, reinforcing it, making it easier for him to say it out loud because he had already been treating me that way. For a long time, just without the words. I didn't realize how much I was holding on to her until everything else started slipping, because my grandmother never made a big show of being on my side. She didn't argue at the dinner table or call anyone out in front of people. She didn't need to. She had this way of seeing things clearly and saying just enough to make you feel steady again. And the first time I remember that feeling was a few months after I moved into the basement. She came over one afternoon without announcing it. Walked through the house slowly, like she was taking inventory of something no one else noticed. And when she got to the basement door, she didn't say anything right away. She just stood there looking at the space at the concrete walls. The low window, the way I had tried to make it look like a normal, and at a room with a few posters and neatly folded blankets, and then she turned to me and said quietly, "This is still my house," not in a loud, possessive way, just a simple fact. Like reminding me of gravity. Nobody's pushing you out of it. And at the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. I thought she was just trying to make me feel better. But there was something in her tone that stuck with me. Something firm. Like she wasn't guessing she knew something I didn't yet. And she kept doing that over the years, dropping these small, precise sentences that didn't seem dramatic but carried weight if you held on to them long enough. And she was the only person who asked me real questions, not the polite kind people ask when they're waiting for you to say I'm fine, but the kind where she actually listened to the answer. How's school really going? Are you sleeping enough? Are you eating properly? And when I said yes, she'd look at me, like she could tell exactly where I was cutting corners and where I was pretending things were okay when they weren't, and she never pushed too hard, never made me defend myself. She just made it clear that I didn't have to perform around her, and that alone felt like relief, because everywhere else I was managing, how I was seen adjusting my behavior, choosing my words carefully, but with her I could sit in the kitchen, drink tea, and not explain anything, and she'd still understand, and she never treated me like I was the problem, which sounds small until you've spent enough time in a place where everything quietly suggests that you are. And she didn't speak badly about my dad or Diane, not directly. She wasn't interested in turning me against anyone, but she also didn't pretend things were normal when they weren't. She would say things like, people believe what they're told if they hear it often enough, or you don't have to agree with something just because it's repeated, and I didn't always connect those comments to what was happening in the house. But later I realized she was giving me a way to think about it, without forcing me to confront it before I was ready, and there were moments where I saw her step in more directly, like when relatives made comments that hinted at the same narrative Diane had been spreading. My grandmother would correct in them calmly, not with a speech, just a short, clear statement that didn't invite debate, that's not accurate, or you're missing context. And the conversation would shift, because she carried authority in a way no one else in that room did. And I think that's part of why she didn't use it carelessly. She understood that timing mattered, that pushing too hard at the wrong moment could make things worse. And I didn't know it then, but she was paying attention to everything, every change in how I was treated, every shift in how my dad spoke about me, every detail that didn't line up. And she never let me feel like I was imagining it, which might have been the most important thing she gave me. Because when you're in a situation like that, where nothing is said directly but everything feels off, you start questioning to your own perception. You start wondering if you're being too sensitive or reading too much into things. And she cut through that without making it complicated. She'd say, if it feels wrong, pay attention to that. And she didn't rush me to act. Didn't tell me to confront anyone or make a scene. She just made sure I stayed grounded in what I knew to be true, and over time that became something I relied on more than I realized, because even when I wasn't with her, I could hear those sentences in my head when something didn't sit right, and then there were the quieter moments that mattered just as much, like her showing up to my graduation when no one else from my immediate family did, sitting front and center, clapping louder than anyone in that room, not in an over-the-top way, just steady, consistent, the way she did everything. And afterward, she took me to lunch like it was the most natural thing in the world, like my achievement deserved to be acknowledged, even if no one else showed up. And she gave me a necklace that had belonged to my mom, something simple but intentional, and she told me to keep it close. And again, it sounded like a small thing at the time. But the way she said it made it feel like more than just a gift, like she was handing me something I'd need later, something that would matter when things got harder. And looking back now, I can see that she was preparing for something. Long before I understood there was anything to prepare for, she wasn't reacting. She was planning quietly, carefully, making sure that when the moment came where I couldn't rely on anyone else, I would still have something solid to stand on. And sitting at that Thanksgiving table after everything had been said and done, after the room had shifted and the truth had started to surface, I could feel that anchor she had given me all those years, not as a memory, but as something real, something that kept me from collapsing in that moment. Because while everyone else was scrambling to make sense of what was happening, I already had a foundation. She had built piece by piece through small conversations, steady presence, and those simple sentences that didn't feel dramatic at the time but turned out to be exactly what I needed when everything else finally came apart. I didn't open the box when she first told me about it, and that restraint ended up mattering more than anything inside it, because the day my grandmother sat me down and explained what she had done didn't feel dramatic at the time. It felt careful, deliberate, like she was handing me something that came with instructions I wasn't allowed to ignore. It was a quiet afternoon in her kitchen, 2 cups of tea already poured before I arrived. The way she always did when she wanted to talk about something serious without making it sound serious. And she didn't start with accusations or anger, she started with clarity. "I've been hearing what Diane has been saying," she told me, steady, direct. And I remember feeling this mix of relief and dread. At the same time, relief, because someone else finally acknowledged it, dread, because saying it out loud made it real, in a way I could no longer avoid. And then she said something that shifted everything. It's not true, not defensive, not emotional, just certain, like she had already verified it and didn't need anyone else to confirm it again. And I asked how she could be so sure, because at that point I had spent years watching my father slowly accept the opposite. And she explained it step by step, not rushed, not vague. She had organized a family health screening months earlier, something that made perfect sense on the surface, because heart disease ran in the family. Everyone participated. Blood samples, saliva samples, consent forms, signed without hesitation, because it all looked routine. And then after that, she contacted a lab and requested an additional test using those same samples, a paternity test. She didn't hide that from me. She told me directly, asked for my consent before proceeding, and I didn't hesitate, because at that point I needed something solid. Something that wasn't based on someone else's opinion or manipulation. And when the results came back, she didn't call me right away. She waited until she could sit me down in person, which tells you everything about how she handled things. She didn't deliver information. Like a headline, she delivered it. Like something you needed to understand fully before reacting to it. And she showed me the report, simple, official, clear, the kind of document that doesn't leave room for interpretation. Probability of paternity 99.998%. And she didn't celebrate it, didn't say "I told you so." She just nodded once, like she had confirmed what she already knew, and then moved on to what mattered next, which wasn't the result itself. It was what to do with it, and that's when the plan started to take shape, not in a dramatic, revenge-driven way, but in a controlled, strategic way that prioritized timing over emotion. She said we could confront them immediately, show the result, force the issue, but she explained why that wouldn't work the way I thought it would, because at that moment my father was already too deep into Diane's version of the story, and presenting the truth without the right context would just trigger denial argument, more manipulation. It would turn into noise instead of resolution. And she refused to let that happen. She wanted the truth to land in a way that couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be spun, couldn't be ignored, and that required patience. So she prepared something more complete. She wrote a letter in her own handwriting, not just stating the facts, but addressing the narrative. Diane had built defending my mother's name clearly and directly, something that couldn't be interrupted or twisted in the moment, because it would be read in full. And she placed that letter together with the DNA results inside a blue shoebox. Nothing special about it on the outside, just an old box that looked like it belonged in the back of a closet. And that was intentional, because she understood that the safest place to hide something important is inside something ordinary. And she added one more thing, a photocopy of a legal document that I didn't fully understand at the time, and she explained where she was keeping it behind her old shoes in. And the hallway closet, not locked away, not hidden in some complicated way, just placed where no one would think to look, because they wouldn't assume anything valuable was there. And then she gave me the instruction that mattered more than anything else. "Don't go looking for trouble," she said, and then after a brief pause, "but if trouble comes to you, that's where your answer is." And that line stayed with me. Not as a warning, but as a boundary, because it meant I wasn't supposed to use this as a weapon whenever I felt hurt or overlooked. I wasn't supposed to force a confrontation just to prove a point. I was supposed to wait until the moment where the truth was necessary, where not speaking would cost more than speaking. And I agreed to that, even though part of me wanted to fix everything immediately, because I trusted her judgment more than my own reactions at that point. And for years after that, conversation. I kept that promise. I didn't open the box, I didn't bring it up, I didn't even check on it, because as long as things stayed at a certain level, uncomfortable but manageable, I could live with it. I could keep moving forward with my life without dragging everything into a confrontation that might not resolve anything, and that restraint wasn't easy, especially as things continued to shift in ways that made it harder to ignore what was happening. But every time I thought, about going to that closet and pulling the box out. I heard her voice again, not telling me what to do, just reminding me why timing mattered. And then she passed away, before she ever got the chance to use it herself. And that changed the weight of everything she had prepared, because now it wasn't just a plan she was going to execute, it was something she had left behind to me to decide when and how to use. And even then, I didn't rush to it. I held on to that instruction. I waited, and by the time Thanksgiving came around and my father stood up and said what he said in front of everyone, I didn't feel surprised. I felt something else. Something closer to recognition, like I had just reached the exact moment my grandmother had been preparing for all along, the moment where the truth wasn't optional anymore. It was necessary, and for the first time since she told me about that box, I knew exactly where my answer was and why I had waited to use it. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I stood up, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, controlled, because if I rushed, it would look like panic, and I wasn't going to give them that, not after everything that had just been said, not after 18 years of being quietly pushed aside only to be publicly erased in under 10 seconds, and the room followed me without anyone actually moving. Forks paused, mid-air conversations cut off halfway through sentences. Even the kids went quiet in that instinctive way they do when something serious is happening, but they don't fully understand it yet. And I didn't look at anyone, not my aunts, not my cousins, not Diane standing there with that tissue pressed to her face like she was already playing the part of concerned witness. I looked straight ahead at the hallway because I knew exactly where I was going. 8 steps, maybe 10. I had counted it earlier without realizing I was counting. And each step felt slower than it should have, not because I was hesitating, but because everything else had slowed down around me, like the room was waiting to see if I was actually going to do something or just walk away and let the moment settle into whatever version Diane would spin next. And I reached the closet door and put my hand on the knob for half a second, just long enough to feel the cool metal, and remember her voice, not a warning, not a command, just that one sentence: "If trouble comes to you, that's where your answer is." And then I opened it, no hesitation, no second guessing, because this was the moment she had prepared for, whether she ever got to see it or not. And the smell hit first lavender and cedar, the same way it always had, grounding, in a way I didn't expect but needed. And I reached past the coats, past the scarves, down behind the row of shoes that no one had bothered to move since she died. And my fingers found the edge of the box exactly where she said it would be, dusty, light, ordinary, and I pulled it out carefully, not like it was fragile, but like it mattered, because it did. And when I turned back toward the dining room, I could feel the shift. Before I even stepped into it, people, leaning forward slightly, trying to see what I was holding without being obvious about it, and Diane's face changed, not completely, not enough for everyone to notice, but enough for me. To the smile gone, the eyes sharper focused, because she recognized it, even if no one else did, and I walked back to the table at the same steady pace. No rush, no hesitation, and set the box down right in the center, between the dishes, between the box down, everything that had just been normal 5 minutes ago and everything that wasn't anymore. And for a second, nobody spoke. Not even my father, who was still standing at the head of the table like he had forgotten how to sit down, and I lifted the lid, slowly. Not for effect, but because my hands were steady, and I wasn't going to fumble this. And on top was the letter exactly where she said it would be, folded familiar, and I took it out first, because that was always the order context. Before proof, truth, before evidence, and Diane moved then, not toward me, but toward the room, turning slightly, like she was addressing an audience, her voice rising just enough to sound emotional, but not enough to sound unstable, saying things about jealousy, about me planning something, about how she had given years to this family. And I let her talk for a few seconds, because cutting her off too early would have made it look like I was hiding something, and then I unfolded the letter and started reading. Not loud, not theatrical, just clear, steady, every word, landing exactly where it needed to my grandmother's handwriting, carrying more authority than anything Diane could say in that moment, and you could feel the room shift again. Not chaotic this time, just quiet in a different way. The kind of quiet where people are actually listening, not waiting for their turn to speak. And I read the parts that mattered about my mother, about the lies that had been told about the chaos. Need for truth. And when I finished, I didn't rush into anything else. I set the letter down deliberately, gave it a second to sit there in front of everyone, and then reached back into the box and pulled out the envelope, the one that mattered in a different way, and I opened it without looking at anyone because I didn't need their reactions yet. I needed them to hear it first, and I read the result exactly as it was written, no interpretation, no added emphasis, just the fact, probability of paternity, 99.998%. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything before. It not shocked, not loud, just this slow, sinking realization spreading across the table as people processed what that meant. And I finally looked up then at my father because this part was for him more than anyone else, and I said it simply, not angry, not emotional, just clear, I am your daughter. And for the first time that night, he didn't look away. He stared at the paper like it might change if he looked long enough, like it could somehow undo what he had just said. And I didn't move toward him, didn't soften it, because this wasn't the moment for that. This was the moment for the truth to stand on its own, without me trying to make it easier for anyone else to accept it. And around the table, people shifted in their seats, some leaning in, some pulling back, the kind of reactions you can't control, because they're not about you anymore. They're about what they have to reconsider, now that the story they believed doesn't hold up. And Diane tried once more, something about tests being wrong, about misunderstandings. But her voice didn't carry the same weight anymore, because the room had already moved past her, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that it was clear she didn't have control of it anymore. And I reached into the box one last time, because I knew this wasn't just about proving who I was, it was about everything that had been built on the opposite claim. And I took out the final document, the one I hadn't fully understood when she first showed it to me. And I placed it on the table next to the others, not rushing, not explaining yet, just letting it sit there as the next piece of something that had already started to come together in a way none of them could ignore anymore. I didn't reach for him when it hit, even though every instinct I'd trained myself to follow for years told me to fix it, to soften it, to make it easier for him to recover from what he'd just done, because that had always been my role in that house, to adjust, to absorb, to keep things from breaking all four. That's the way. But this time, I stayed where I was and let it land, and you could see it move through the room in pieces, not all at once, like people were catching up at different speeds. My uncle leaned forward first, squinting at the paper like he wanted to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. Something simple. One of my aunts covered her mouth with her hand and didn't say anything, but her eyes moved from me to my father and back again, like she was recalculating everything she thought she knew. Someone near the end of the table let out a quiet wait under their breath, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to show the shift had started. And then there was my father, still standing still, gripping the back of his chair, but the certainty he had a minute ago was gone, completely gone, replaced by something slower, heavier, like the realization had to push its way through everything Diane had spent years building in his head. And when he finally reached for the paper, his hands weren't steady, not in a dramatic shaking way, just enough that you could hear the faint sound of it moving between his fingers, and he read it once, then again. Like the second time might give him a different result, and the room stayed quiet, not out of respect, but because nobody wanted to interrupt what was happening in real time, the moment where a man realizes he's been wrong in a way that can't be brushed off or explained away. And when he looked up, he didn't look at me first. He looked at Diane, and that was the part that told me everything, because for the first time he wasn't looking to her for confirmation, he was looking at her for an answer. And she didn't have one ready that fit the situation anymore. Not one that could compete with a printed result sitting in the middle of the table. So she did what she always did when control started slipping. She tried to redirect her, voice sharper now, less polished, talking about manipulation, about timing, about how I had planned this. But it didn't land the same way it used to, because the room had already shifted its attention, and people weren't watching her anymore. They were watching him, waiting to see what he would do with what was in front of him, and he said it slowly, like each word cost him something. "You told me, not loud, not angry yet, just confused in a way that felt heavier than yelling you told. Tell me, she wasn't mine!" And Diane straightened, tried to hold her. The ground, but there was a crack there now visible. If you knew where to look, because this wasn't a conversation she could guide anymore. And she said something about believing what she had seen, about doing what she thought was right, but it sounded thinner, less certain, like she was buying time more than making a case. And my father shook his head once small, almost like he was trying to clear it. And then the next sentence came out. Different, sharper, more direct. "Margaret was my wife." And the room reacted to that. Not loudly, but you could feel it, the way people shifted, the way a couple of my aunts froze in the doorway, the plate still in their hands. Because that wasn't just a statement, it was a correction, a line being drawn that hadn't been there before. And he followed it with the part that mattered most, the part that changed everything that had just been said 10 minutes earlier. "And Stella is my daughter." And when he said, "my name," it didn't sound like a label he was testing. It sounded like something he was recognizing again, something he had pushed aside and was now forced to face. And then he sat down. Not in a controlled way. His legs just gave out, like the effort of standing had been holding him together. And once that was gone, there was nothing left to keep him upright. And he put his head in his hands, shoulders tight, not crying in a Pras's loud way, but clearly not okay. And I stood there a few feet away, close enough that I could have reached him, could have put a hand on his shoulder, could have said something to make it easier, but I didn't move. Because this wasn't a moment I was responsible for managing. This was his to sit in and around us. The room kept adjusting people, standing up slowly, some moving toward the kitchen, some stepping back like they needed space from the table itself. Conversations starting in low voices, not about me anymore. Not about whether what he said earlier was true, but about what had just happened, about what it meant. And Diane was still standing, but she looked different now, not composed. Not in control, her posture tighter, her voice coming faster when she spoke, trying to pull him back, telling him not to overreact, telling him this was exactly what I wanted, but he didn't respond to her, not even a glance, and that silence did more than anything he could have said because it showed where. His attention had shifted, and she tried again louder. This time, a little edge in it, but it only made the distance more obvious. Because no one else picked up on it the way they would have earlier. No one echoed her, no one stepped in to support her version of events, and one of my cousins, who had been quiet the whole time, shook his head slightly and looked away, and that small reaction carried more weight than any argument. Because it showed the consensus forming without anyone needing to say it out loud, and then someone opened the front door, maybe for air, maybe to leave, and the sound cut through everything. A reminder that the night was still moving forward, even if the dynamic in that room had completely changed, and I realized standing there that nothing was going back to what it had been before, not because of what I had said, but because the foundation Diane had built her version of the story on had just collapsed in a way that couldn't be rebuilt the same way again, and my father was sitting in the middle of that collapse, finally seeing it for what it was. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough that he couldn't unsee it anymore, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of making sense of it. I slid the last document closer to the center of the table and didn't rush to explain it because I wanted them to see it before they heard anything from me. 4 stapled pages, a clean copy with my grandmother's handwriting in the margin, the kind of notes she used when she wanted to make sure nothing important got overlooked, and I said it plainly. No buildup. The original is with her attorney. This is a copy, and you could feel the attention tighten again, not the chaotic kind from earlier, but focused. Because at this point people understood that whatever came next wasn't speculation. It was going to be something that had been prepared, verified, put into place long before any of us sat down for dinner, and I read the section that mattered steady clear. I, Eleanor Marie Frost, being of sound, mind amend my last will and testament to leave the family residence at 14 Maple Hill Road to my granddaughter Stella Margaret Frost in full and unconditional ownership, and I didn't add anything to it, didn't interpret it, because the language didn't need help. It was direct in a way that doesn't leave room for negotiation, and the reaction was immediate but controlled a few quiet exhalations, a chair shifting, someone whispering, "Wait," and I saw it land differently on each person, some surprised, some not as surprised as they probably should have been, like pieces were connecting for them at the same time they were connecting for my father, who lifted his head slowly and looked at the page like it might change if he blinked. And then at Diane, and that look wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition paired with something sharper, something closer to accusation, because this wasn't just about what the document said. It was about what hadn't been said. And he asked it the only way he could at that point, not loud, not controlled, just raw. "You told me she left everything to me." And Diane stepped forward like she could still manage it, like she could still redirect the outcome, if she framed it the right way, saying something about misunderstandings, about paperwork, about how things weren't always final until probate, using words that sounded technical enough to create doubt, but not specific enough to hold up. And I let her finish because interrupting her would have turned it into a debate. And this wasn't a debate, this was documentation. And I pointed to the margin where my grandmother had written the attorney's name and office, Alderman and Associates, and I said, "He has the original notarized witness filed," keeping it simple because the more straightforward it was, harder it would be to spin. And one of my aunts, who had been quiet the entire time, spoke up from the side of the room, not dramatic, just factual. I remember her mentioning a change, and that was enough to shift the room again, because it added a second point of confirmation that didn't come from me, and Diane's posture changed, then not dramatically, but enough to show she understood the direction this was going. Her shoulders tighter, her voice coming faster, trying to pull it back to something she could control. But the problem with legal documents is they don't respond to emotion. They don't adjust to tone. They either exist or they don't. And this one did. And my father looked down at the page again, then back up, and said the part that mattered more than anything else. "You hid this," not a question, a statement, and Diane opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out that matched the weight of what was sitting in front of us, because there wasn't a version of this where she could explain away why he had never been told, why letters from a law office had gone unanswered, why a process that should have been straightforward had been quietly redirected. And the room picked up on that before anyone said it out loud, the way people do when something becomes obvious enough that it doesn't need to be stated. And one by one, the reactions shifted from uncertainty to distance, not loud, not confrontational, just subtle steps back. A cousin crossing his arms and leaning away, an aunt turning toward the kitchen without looking at Diane. A friend of hers who had been nodding earlier now focused on her phone, like she didn't want to be part of whatever came next. And that's how control leaves a room, not with a single moment, but with a series of small decisions where people choose not to support what's falling apart, and Diane saw it happening. You could tell by the way she looked around. Not at me, not at my father, but at everyone else, like she was checking for alignment and not finding it. And she tried one more time, softer now, appealing. Instead of asserting, talking about years invested, about intentions, about how she had done what she thought was best for the family. But it didn't land, not because the words were wrong, but because they didn't match the evidence anymore. And my father didn't respond to that either. He stayed where he was looking at the document, then at me, and for the first time that night, there was no distance in that look, just a clear, uncomfortable understanding of what had actually happened. And I didn't push it further, didn't list everything that had been done or everything that had been said over the years, because I didn't need to. The combination of the DNA result and the will had already done the work. It had shifted entire narrative from something debatable to something defined. And I said the last part simply, "The house is mine," not as a threat, not as a victory, just as a fact that needed to be acknowledged. And the silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, not tense, not waiting, just settled in a way that comes when a situation stops being unclear. And Diane stepped back, then physically a small movement but noticeable, and reached for her purse like she needed something to hold on to. And no one stopped her. No one argued. No one tried to smooth it over because at that point, there wasn't anything left to negotiate. The outcome had already been set long before that dinner. It had just taken this moment for everyone to see it clearly. I left before anyone tried to turn it into a conversation. I wasn't ready to have stepped out into the cold air and let it hit me for a second, not to calm down, but to feel something that wasn't everyone else's reaction. And over the next few days, everything slowed into the kind of aftermath people don't talk about: the calls, the messages, the quiet apologies from relatives who said they should have seen it sooner. And I didn't spend much time responding because I already knew what mattered and what didn't. And then my dad asked to meet, not at the house, not somewhere tied to everything that had just happened, but at a small coffee shop, halfway between us, neutral ground, and I agreed, because avoiding it would have just stretched it out longer. And when I walked in, he was already there, sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, both hands wrapped around it, like it was doing more for him than the drink itself. And he looked older, not dramatically, just worn in a way that comes from realizing something you can't undo. And he didn't start with excuses, which I noticed right away. He said he had been going through old photos, that he had been trying to piece together where things started to change. And I sat down across from him and let him talk, because for once, he wasn't trying to control the narrative, he was trying to understand it. And he said he had believed what he was told, because it came at a time when he was already vulnerable, already looking for something to make sense of losing my mom. And I didn't interrupt him, but I also didn't let that explanation turn into a justification, because there's a difference between understanding why something happened and accepting it as okay. And when he finished, I told him the truth the same way I had told it at the table. Simple, direct. You chose to believe her, and he didn't argue with that, which mattered more than anything else he could have said, because for the first time he wasn't deflecting it. And then he said he was sorry, and I could see he meant it, not in a performative way, not looking for immediate forgiveness, just stating it because it needed to be said. And I took a second before responding, because this was the part where it would have been easy to fall back into old patterns to smooth it over, to accept it quickly so things could go back to something that felt like normal, but normal was exactly what had allowed everything to go on for as long as it did. So I told him the part he needed to hear, even if it wasn't what I wanted. I'm not ready to forgive you, and I said it calmly, not to punish him, but to be honest about where I was, because forgiveness isn't something you give to make someone else feel better. It's something that comes after change, after consistency, after time. And he nodded, not happy about it, but accepting it. And that was the first real step forward, not the apology, but his willingness to sit with an answer that didn't resolve everything immediately. And I told him what I needed going forward. Not in a list, not in demands, just clear boundaries that the prosative canon in the tenene house was mine. And it wasn't up for discussion that Diane wasn't part of my life anymore, and that wasn't negotiable, and that if he wanted to be part of my life, it had to be based on something new, not the version of our relationship that had existed before. And he agreed without trying to adjust any of it, which again mattered more than if he had tried to negotiate. And we sat there for a while after that, not saying much, just letting it settle into something that wasn't fixed but wasn't broken in the same way anymore either. And when I left, I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I understood that moving forward required me to stop checking whether he was okay with the direction I was going in. And over the next few weeks, I started spending time at the house again, not as someone trying to fit into it, but as someone who actually owned it. And that shift felt different in ways that are hard to explain until you experience it. I wasn't waiting to be included. I was deciding what stayed and what didn't, what memories I kept and what I let go of. And I found things that reminded me of who I had been before. Everything got complicated: photos, small objects, pieces of a life that hadn't been defined by someone else's version of events. And I put those things back where they belonged, not to recreate the past, but to acknowledge it on my own terms. And every now and then I would hear from my dad, short messages, simple check-ins, nothing forced, nothing over the top, and I responded when I felt like it. Not out of obligation, but because I was choosing to, and that was the difference. Everything going forward was a choice, not a reaction. And that's the part people don't always understand. When they hear stories like this, they expect some kind of clean ending, a moment where everything is resolved and everyone moves on like nothing happened. But real change doesn't work like that. It's slower, it requires boundaries that feel uncomfortable at first. It requires accepting that some relationships don't go back to what they were and maybe never should. And if there's one thing I took from all of it, it's this time doesn't fix anything on its own. It just gives people more chances to either change or repeat the same patterns, and forgiveness isn't automatic. It's earned through actions that match the words. And most importantly, you don't have to keep proving your worth to people who decided not to see it. You don't have to stay in a place where you're constantly adjusting yourself to fit into someone else's version of who you should be, because at some point, you have to decide that your place in your own life isn't something anyone else gets to take away from you. And if you've ever felt that slow, shift, that feeling of being pushed to the edges without anyone saying it out loud, pay attention to it, trust it, because ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just delays the moment you finally have to face it. And when that moment comes, you don't have to handle it perfectly. You just have to handle it honestly. The rest will follow.